There is a rule in the Night Court that no one says aloud, but everyone obeys. The Vampire King does not look at what he is not offered. He takes blood by invitation only, love not at all, and mercy never. For 300 years, he has ruled from a candlelit throne with his eyes fixed on the middle distance, because looking too closely at anything is how a man remembers what he has lost. So, when a veiled woman is delivered to his court as payment for her family's debt, no one expects him to ask her name. They certainly do not expect him to forbid anyone, on pain of death, from lifting her veil before he does. The court calls it cruelty. It is, in fact, the first curious thing he has wanted in 100 years. 10 years ago, Wren Ashcombe stopped showing her face to anyone but her sister. The scar that claims the left side of her jaw and throat, pale, ropey, dragged from an accident nobody in her village will name aloud, has been a life sentence since she was 16. She has learned to be a shape in a doorway, a voice behind cloth, a girl who is easier to forget than to look at. She expects the Night Court to be no different. She does not expect to be seen at all. She certainly does not expect a king who cannot bear to be looked at either. The debt collectors did not knock. They came into the Ashcombe cottage at dawn with the ledger already open, reciting numbers that meant nothing to Wren, except that her father was dead and had left behind a hole shaped exactly like everything he owed. Her sister Della wept at the table. Wren did not weep. She had used up her tears on smaller griefs years ago, rationing what was left for the day she might actually need it. "There is a settlement," the tallest of the collectors said, not unkindly, reading from a scroll stamped with a wax seal the colour of dried blood. "The Night Court will absorb your father's debt in full, in exchange for one member of this household entering permanent service to the crown." Della's hand found Wren's under the table, and Wren understood before her sister said a word that Della meant to offer herself. Della, who had a face people liked to look at. So, Della, who had suitors and a future, and a laugh that made rooms brighter. Wren watched her sister's mouth open to volunteer her whole life away to spare a sister who had already given up on being looked at, and something in Wren went hard and clear, the way water goes to ice in a single held breath. "I'll go," Wren said. The collector's eyes flicked to the veil she always wore, the fine dark gauze that covered the left side of her face and throat, and something crossed his expression that might have been pity or might have been calculation. "The Night Court does not typically take," he began. "I'll go," Wren said again, and this time nobody argued because there was nothing underneath her voice that left room for argument. She had spent 10 years learning how to disappear. She could disappear into a debt as easily as into a doorway. They took her that same evening, in a black carriage with no windows, down a road that grew colder and darker the longer they travelled, until the trees themselves seemed to lean away from the path like frightened animals. The Night Court rose out of the dark like something grown rather than built. Black stone towers threaded with ivy that had no business surviving winter, hundreds of candles burning behind red glass, a smell of wax and rain, and something colder underneath both. Wren clutched her small bag of belongings and did not let herself shake. She was brought before the throne in a hall, so vast her footsteps sounded like a trespass. Courtiers lined the walls in silks, the colour of wine and midnight, murmuring behind painted fans. And at the centre of it all, on a throne of black stone worn smooth by 300 years of the same body, sitting the same way, was the Vampire King. He was not what she expected. She had braced for a monster and found instead a man carved out of stillness, pale as good marble, dark hair swept back from a face arranged in the particular blankness of someone who has trained himself not to feel things in front of an audience. His eyes found her before she had finished crossing the hall, and something about the way he looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her, made her want to step back into the shadows she'd been standing in a moment before. "Name," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had never needed to be raised to be obeyed. "Wren Ashcombe, Your Majesty, you came in your sister's place." It was not a question, which meant someone had already told him, which meant he had already known before she arrived, and let her say it anyway to see what she would do with the truth. Wren lifted her chin behind the veil. "My sister has a life worth keeping whole. I have a debt worth paying." A murmur moved through the courtiers, scandalized, delighted, the sound of people who had not heard anyone speak to their king without flinching in longer than they could remember. The king's eyes did not leave her face, or what he could see of her face, which was only her eyes and the set of her jaw above the veil's edge. "Remove it," said a voice from the crowd, a woman's voice, silk smooth and cold, and Wren turned enough to see a courtier in deep violet stepping forward, beautiful in the sharp, finished way of someone who has never doubted the value of her own face. Later, Wren would learn her name was Isolde, a noblewoman who had spent a decade angling to be the king's consort and resented anyone who drew his attention without trying. "Let us see what the crown has purchased." Wren's hand rose instinctively to the edge of her veil, not to remove it, but to hold it in place, and it was the king who spoke before her fingers finished the motion. "No one touches her veil," he said, and though his voice did not rise, the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Not you, Isolde? Not anyone in this hall?" "Not until she offers it herself." Isolde's mouth thinned into something that was not quite a smile. "Your Majesty is generous with a stranger's modesty." "Your Majesty," he said, correcting nothing about his tone, "does not explain himself twice." He looked back to Wren, and for a moment something moved behind his eyes that she could not name. Recognition, maybe, though they had never met, or something closer to relief, as though a question he had stopped asking had just been unexpectedly answered. "You will serve in the East Wing, in the kitchens and the library, wherever labor is needed. You will not be summoned to the blood halls. You will not be asked to give anything you do not choose to give. Is that understood?" It was not the arrangement she had braced for. She had expected chains, or worse, the particular indignity of being asked to bare her throat to strangers for coin. Instead, she had been handed something that looked almost like protection, offered by a man whose face gave away nothing about why he was offering it. "Understood, Your Majesty," she said. "Good!" He rose from the throne, taller than she'd expected, his black coat falling in severe, formal lines that gave away nothing of the body beneath it. No bared chest, no performance of power, just the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to prove anything with his body. "Wren Ashcombe, see that she is settled." He was gone before she could find a response, disappearing through a side door with the kind of economy of movement that suggested he had left rooms exactly this way 10,000 times before and had never once looked back to see what he left behind. That night, alone in a narrow servant's room with a single candle and a door that locked from the inside, her own choice, though no one had asked her to lock it, Wren allowed herself to cry, finally, for her father's death and her sister's spared life, and the strange, unsettling kindness of a king who had looked at her like she was a person worth protecting before he had any reason to know if she was worth anything at all. She did not know yet that he had looked at her that way because for the first time in 300 years, looking at someone had not hurt. Sleep did not come easily that first night. The castle made unfamiliar sounds, the settling of ancient stone, the distant murmur of the fountain that would not begin running until midnight, the wind finding every gap in the old windows and turning it into something like a low, constant song. Wren lay awake, listening to all of it, cataloguing the strangeness of her new life, the way she might once have catalogued a stranger's face, searching for the detail that would tell her whether she was safe. She thought of her father, 3 days dead, and found that grief arrived alongside something she had not expected, a small, private relief that he would never know how close his debts had come to costing his daughters everything, nor how strange and unlikely the rescue had turned out to be. She thought of her mother, gone 5 years before that, who had been the last person besides Della to look at Wren's scarred face without flinching, and who had told her, in the last months of her illness, that a person's worth was never carried in their face, regardless of what a village decided to believe. She thought, finally, before sleep took her, of the king's eyes finding hers across that vast hall, direct, unflinching, curious in a way that asked nothing and demanded nothing, only looked, plainly, at whatever was there to be seen. She did not yet have a name for the feeling that thought produced. She would learn it, in time, though it would take longer than either of them expected for her to trust it as anything other than a dangerous kind of hope. The terms of her service, she learned over the following days, were stranger than she expected. She was given a room of her own, small but private, with a bed and a wash basin and a window that looked out over a garden that only bloomed at night, moonflowers and night-blooming jasmine, and a species of pale rose that opened only after the sun went down. She was assigned to the library 3 days a week, the kitchens, the other 4, and told plainly by the steward, a dry, efficient woman named Marta, that she was never, under any circumstance, to enter the West Wing after dark. "That is where His Majesty keeps to himself," Marta said, folding linens with the brisk economy of someone who had explained this rule to 100 new servants before Wren, and expected to explain it 100 more. "He does not want company. He has not wanted company in longer than I have worked here, and I have worked here longer than I care to say." "Why does he keep me from the blood halls?" Wren asked, because it was the question that had followed her since the throne room, worrying at the edges of her relief like a loose thread. Marta's hands stilled for a moment on the linen. "Because the last woman he took blood from himself, willingly, with his own mouth, and not a courtier's offered wrist, was the queen he lost 200 years ago. He has not touched another woman's throat since. Not out of grief alone, out of a curse, though no one is meant to speak of it, and I am only telling you, because you will hear worse rumours if I don't." She met Wren's eyes, steady and grave. "The old queen's death carried a price, a witch curse, laid by the one who killed her, binding him to the night eternal, and to a heart that cannot love again, not without dying of it, quite literally, the way a body dies of poison. He has not risked feeling anything for 200 years, because the curse makes feeling lethal. Do you understand what I am telling you, girl?" Wren understood. She understood it the way she understood her own veil, a wound made into a wall, protection built out of avoidance, a life organized entirely around the thing you could not survive touching. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good. Then you'll understand why it matters that he told the whole court not to touch your veil, and why every soul in this castle is currently placing wagers on what that means." Marta's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "For what it's worth, girl, he does not do things without reason. He has had 300 years to learn efficiency. If he spent his breath protecting you, it's because some part of him decided you were worth the expenditure." That evening, Wren was summoned, not to the throne room, but to a small private study off the library, where the king sat behind a desk stacked with correspondence, reading by candlelight with a concentration so complete he did not look up when she entered. "You wished to see me, Your Majesty. I wished to state terms plainly, since court gossip tends to arrive more distorted than the truth." He set down his letter and looked at her, really looked, the way he had in the throne room, direct and unhurried, as though her veiled face were not an absence he was working around, but a whole and complete thing he was simply choosing not to rush past. You will not be asked to give blood. You will not be asked to remove your veil. You will not be summoned to my chambers. Tonight, or any night, for any purpose, you have not chosen for yourself. In exchange, your father's debt is settled. The moment you walked through my gates, it was settled before you arrived. In fact, you do not need to earn your sister's freedom. It is already bought. Wren's breath caught. Cat. Then why keep me here at all? Something flickered across his face, the closest thing to uncertainty she had seen from him. Because you asked to come in your sister's place, without being asked to justify why your life was the one worth spending. I have watched 300 years of people bargain and beg and posture for advantage in this court. I have never watched someone offer themselves up so plainly, for no reason but that someone else deserved better. He looked down at his letters, and for a moment the stillness in him seemed less like control, and more like a man carefully not reaching for something he had decided he was not allowed to want. Stay if you wish it, go if you don't. The debt is paid regardless, but I confess I would prefer you stayed. She had not expected that. Cold over cruelty. She would always choose cold over cruelty, and there was no cruelty here, only a strange, careful courtesy from a man the whole court seemed to fear. I'll stay, she said, and meant it more than the sentence should have warranted, given how little time had passed since her father's debt collectors walked into her family's kitchen. He nodded once, as though the matter was settled and required no further ceremony, and returned to his letters. She left the study with her heart beating strangely fast, and did not understand, yet, that he had listened to the sound of it the entire time she stood there, and that for a man whose curse made him fear his own heartbeat, quickening for anyone, hearing hers had felt like the first warm thing in 200 years of cold. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm Wren had not expected to find comforting. Mornings in the kitchens, kneading bread beside a cook named Old Tam who did not care what her face looked like so long as her hands worked fast. Afternoons in the library cataloguing texts in a hand steady enough that the head librarian stopped checking her work after the second week. Evenings, increasingly in the king's study, summoned, for reasons that grew flimsier each time, a question about a book she'd shelved, a request to read aloud from a volume. His eyes, he claimed, were too tired to pass, though she never once saw him look tired. She began to notice things about him, the way he never ate in front of others, though he sat at meals out of formality, the way his hand, when it brushed hers passing a book, was cold as river stone, and how he flinched a half-second after the contact, as though bracing for pain that never quite arrived. The way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, not at her veiled face, but at her hands, her posture, the careful economy of movement she'd built over 10 years of trying to take up as little space as possible. You move like someone who has spent a long time trying not to be seen, he said one evening, apropos of nothing, while she reshelved a stack of histories he had pretended to need reorganized. Wren's hands stilled on the spines. Your Majesty is observant. Your Majesty has had 300 years, with very little else to occupy his attention besides observing people. A pause. You do not have to answer if it is not mine to ask. But I find myself curious how a person learns that particular kind of stillness. I recognize it. I have some of it myself. She should have deflected. She had deflected this exact question from strangers 100 times over 10 years, turning conversations away from her scar, with the practiced ease of a woman closing a door before anyone could see inside the room. But something about the study's candlelight, and the particular quality of his attention, not curious in the way that wanted a story to gawk at, but curious in the way that wanted to understand her, made the door swing open before she could stop it. "An accident when I was 16, she said. "A kiln collapsed in my family's pottery workshop. My sister was inside it. I pulled her out before the second collapse, and the fire caught the side of my face and throat on the way." She kept her voice level, the way she'd trained it to stay level over a decade of retelling. "The healers saved my life. They could not save the scar. My village decided, somewhere in the year that followed, that a scarred girl was a girl to look away from, and I decided it was easier to help them look away than to make them uncomfortable by being seen." The king was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its careful evenness. "You pulled your sister from a collapsing kiln, and your reward was to spend a decade being told your face was something to apologize for." "That's a very generous way of framing an ordinary tragedy, Your Majesty." "It is not generous. It is accurate." His jaw tightened, the first unguarded expression she had seen cross his face. "I have watched this court destroy people for imagined slights and reward cruelty, dressed as wit, for 300 years. I have very little patience left for the idea that a scar earned saving someone's life is a thing to be ashamed of." He looked at her, and this time there was something raw underneath the stillness, something that had cracked without his permission. "For what it's worth, and I understand it may be worth very little, coming from behind a veil of my own, I do not need to see your face to know there is nothing on it that requires hiding." Wren's chest did something complicated and warm, an ache that was not entirely painful. "You wear a veil too, Your Majesty. I've seen your face plainly enough. Not that kind." He looked down at his own hands, pale and still on the desk. "I have not let myself feel anything toward another person in 200 years, because feeling too much, for me, is not metaphorical. It is a mechanism, a curse with teeth. I have built my own veil out of distance instead of cloth, and I have worn it so long I sometimes forget it is a costume and not simply my face." He looked back up at her, and the directness of it made her want to step backward and closer at the same time. "I recognize the particular exhaustion of building a life around a wound you are not permitted to show anyone. I imagine that is why I find myself, against every instinct 300 years has taught me, wanting to keep talking to you." She should have left. Every rule of self-preservation she had built over a decade told her to leave, to bow, to retreat to her small room and lock the door and let this strange, dangerous warmth cool before it did more damage than good. Instead, she stayed another hour, reading aloud from a history of the Night Court's founding, while he listened with his eyes closed and his hands very still on the desk. And when she finally did leave, she caught him watching her go with an expression she did not have a name for yet, though she would learn it later as longing. The next morning, old Tam noticed the change in her before Wren herself had put words to it. "You're humming," the old cook said, not looking up from the dough. She was kneading, flour dusting her forearms to the elbow. 10 weeks in this kitchen, and I've never once heard you hum. I wasn't aware I was humming." "That's usually how it works, girl." Tam's eyes, sharp despite her age, slid sideways with unmistakable amusement. "It's the king, isn't it? Don't bother denying it. Half the kitchen staff has a wager running on how long it'll take His Majesty to stop pretending he needs help reorganizing books he catalogued himself 2 centuries ago." "Pot." Wren's hands stilled on the bread she was shaping. "There's nothing to deny. He's kind to me, that's all." "Kind," Tam snorted, a sound of pure disbelief. "Girl, I have worked in this castle for 40 years. I watched 3 different noble women throw themselves at that man with every trick a determined woman can devise, and he looked at every single one of them like they were pieces of furniture he was mildly inconvenienced to have in the room. He does not look at you like furniture. She flicked flour from her hands and fixed Wren with a look that was, for once, entirely without teasing. Be careful with that man's heart, whatever else you do. I don't think it's broken as badly as the court believes, but I don't think it's whole either, and a thing like that deserves gentler hands than most. Wren thought about that warning for the rest of the day, turning it over the way she once turned over the question of her own scar, worrying at it, testing its edges, trying to decide how much of the caution was fear and how much was simply wisdom she would be foolish to ignore. She thought about it still, that evening, shelving a stack of astronomical charts in the library's upper gallery, when she became aware of the particular quality of silence that meant she was being watched. He stood at the base of the gallery stairs, not hiding his presence, simply waiting with the patience of a man who had 300 years of practice at waiting for things. Old Tam has opinions about us, Wren said, before she could stop herself. Old Tam has opinions about everyone. It is rather her defining trait. A pause, and then more carefully, are her opinions unwelcome? No. Wren came down the gallery stairs, careful of the worn stone, careful of the way her pulse had picked up simply from the sight of him waiting there. She said, I should be careful with your heart. That it isn't as broken as the court believes, but isn't whole either. Something moved across his face, surprise, and beneath the surprise, something gentler. She is not wrong on either count. He held out a hand to help her down the last step, an old-fashioned courtesy she had not expected from a king who otherwise dispensed with ceremony whenever he could. I have spent 2 centuries telling myself the pieces of it that survived my queen's death was sufficient. I am only now beginning to suspect I was settling for survival when I might have had something closer to living. The Obsidian Archive was the coldest room in the castle, a chamber built 2 levels below the library, where sunlight had never once touched, kept at a chill even the servants avoided unless duty required it. It was there, 3 weeks into her service, that the king found her searching for a text on the region's mining history and asked, without any preamble she could pass, whether she trusted him. That's an unusual question, Your Majesty. It is. He shut the door behind him, an old iron thing that sealed with a heavy final sound, and the archive went dark, except for the single candle she'd brought down with her. I would like to try something, if you'll allow it. It requires darkness, and it requires trust, and it requires that you understand you may stop it at any moment with a single word, and I will stop immediately and never raise the subject again. Her pulse quickened despite herself. What is it you wish to try? I would like to touch your face, not to see it, the dark will see to that, only to touch it, to know it the way. You know a room you've lived in your whole life without ever needing a lamp. His voice had gone low and careful, the voice of a man handling something breakable. I understand. If the answer is no, I have no right to ask, and less right to expect an answer. I would like. Wren's hand rose to the edge of her candle, and she understood, in the space of a held breath, what he was offering her. Not curiosity, not a demand to see what she had spent 10 years hiding, but a way of being known that required no eyes at all, only the same darkness that made his own curse survivable. Blow out the candle first, she said. Both of us should be equally blind. He did, and the archive fell into a darkness so complete she could hear her own heartbeat in it, and his, closer now, though she had not heard him cross the room. His hands found hers first, cold as always and steady in a way that steadied something in her chest to match it. Tell me if you want to stop, he said, and then, slowly, so slowly, she had time to refuse 12 times over, and did not. His fingers found the edge of her veil. She let him lift it. His hands moved over her face in the dark, not with the clinical curiosity of a healer or the recoiling flinch she had braced her whole body to expect, but with something closer to reverence, tracing the ropey pull of scar tissue along her jaw and down the side of her throat, the way a man might trace the spine of a book he'd been waiting years to finally read. He did not flinch, he did not hesitate. His thumb moved along the worst of the scarring, at her throat, where the fire had reached deepest, and he went still there, his breath audibly caught. "This is where you were burned worst?" he said, not a question. "Yes." "Pulling your sister out?" "Yes." His forehead came to rest against hers in the dark, cold skin against her overheated one, and when he spoke again, his voice had cracked entirely open. "I have touched 100 faces in 300 years and felt nothing for any of them. I am touching yours in the dark, unable to see a single feature of it, and I have never in 2 centuries felt anything so completely like coming home." His hands framed her face, careful of the scarring, reverent of all of it. "She hadn't expected that," he murmured, and she realized distantly that he was speaking about her, narrating her own reaction back to her, because he could feel it in the tremor of her jaw beneath his palms. "Neither had I." "You should be afraid," she whispered. "The curse. Marta told me. What feeling costs you?" "I am afraid," he admitted, and his thumb traced one more slow line along her scar, as if memorizing it against a future where he might have to survive without the memory. "I am more afraid of not knowing what your face feels like under my hands than I am of a curse that has already taken everything else from me worth losing." He pulled back slightly, though his hands stayed at her jaw. "I am not asking you to remove this veil in the light, Ren. I am not entitled to that, and I will not ask for it until you offer it freely, if you ever do. But I needed you to know that I have felt you now, in the dark, in the one language my curse will still allow me to speak, and it was not tragedy I found there. It was the first thing in 200 years that felt like being alive." She was in danger of staying exactly where she was forever. She could feel it, the danger of it, the warmth pooling low and dangerous in her chest, and she did not step back. "Mine," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. Though it was less a claim than a confession, the words slipping out of him like something he had not given himself permission to say and could not, in the end, hold back. Neither of them moved to relight the candle for a long time. When at last they did, the small flame threw its light across the obsidian shelves in long, wavering shapes, and Ren lowered the veil back into place with hands that trembled only slightly, more from the enormity of what had passed between them than from any lingering fear. The king watched her do it without protest, without the faintest suggestion that he expected the veil to stay lifted a moment longer than she wished it to, and something in that patience settled a fear in her she had not fully named even to herself, the old, quiet terror that any man who touched her scar would feel entitled, afterward, to see it whenever he pleased. As though tenderness were a key that unlocked ownership, he did not reach for the veil again. He simply gathered the fallen candle, relit it from the small flint kept for that purpose on the archive's lowest shelf, and offered her his arm to climb the stairs back toward the ordinary, lamp-lit world above, as though nothing so extraordinary had happened in the dark that it required acknowledgement beyond what they had already given it. "Thank you," he said at the top of the stairs, with a formality that somehow made the words land harder than they might have otherwise. "I know what I asked of you tonight was not small. I will not forget that you gave it anyway." "Neither will I," Ren said, and meant several things at once by it. Something had shifted after the archive, though neither of them named it aloud. He summoned her more often now, not with the flimsy pretexts of book questions, but plainly, honestly, sending Marta to fetch her for no better reason than that he wished for her company. They spoke of small things and large ones, her sister's letters, arriving weekly now that Della understood her family's debt was paid and her sister was, against every expectation, thriving. His queen, dead 2 centuries, and mourned in a way that had calcified into isolation rather than healing, a grief he was only now, he admitted, learning to set down without feeling as though he were betraying her memory by doing so. She would not have wanted this, he told Wren one evening, meaning the 2 centuries of solitude, not meaning Wren herself, though Wren felt the distinction blur pleasantly at the edges. She was not a woman who believed grief should be a life sentence. I think I clung to the isolation because it was easier than admitting I was afraid to want anything again, in case wanting cost me the way loving her once did. And now? Wren asked. He looked at her with an expression she had learned over these past weeks to read as clearly as any book she'd shelved. Now I find myself wanting quite a lot and considerably less afraid of the cost than I expected to be. There was a political undercurrent to all this warmth, though one Wren felt more than understood in those early weeks. Isolde's cold civility curdling visibly into something sharper every time the king's attention found Wren across a room, the murmurs among the court growing louder and less kind. Whispered speculation about what a veiled servant girl could possibly offer a king who had turned away noble women and princesses alike for 2 centuries. "She'll move against you," Marta warned one afternoon, folding linens with unusual intensity. "Isolde, she has wanted his crown longer than you've been alive, girl, and she will not watch a serving girl take what she's spent a decade angling for without a fight. And I want nothing from him but his company," Wren said, which was, she was beginning to realize, no longer entirely true. That will not matter to her. Perception is a currency in this court, and right now the perception is that the king looks at you the way he has not looked at anyone since his queen died. That alone is a declaration of war, whether either of you meant it as one. The atmospheric hush of the castle at night had become, for Wren, a comfort rather than a threat. Moonlight through the tall windows, the particular quality of quiet that only existed after the last candle in the servants' quarters had guttered out, the scent of the night garden drifting up through the stones, jasmine and cold air, and something like safety. She had not expected to find safety inside a debt she'd been sold into. She had not expected either to find herself standing outside the king's study one night, unsummoned, simply because some part of her wanted to be near him more than she wanted to sleep. He opened the door before she could knock, as though he'd heard her hesitating in the corridor, which perhaps he had. His senses, she was learning, ran sharper than any human's. "I wasn't summoned," she said, feeling suddenly foolish. "I am aware." He stepped back to let her in anyway, something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth, rare enough on him, that she had started collecting the sight of it the way she'd once collected pressed flowers. "I confess I have been hoping you might come unsummoned. Eventually, it would mean considerably more than an obligation fulfilled." She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her, and neither of them moved to summon Marta or announce the hour, or observe any of the careful proprieties that had governed every other evening they'd spent in each other's company. The atmosphere in the room had changed, gone thick with something neither of them named, moonlight, falling through the tall window across the desk between them, catching the pale planes of his face in silver, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other, she, veiled, he, unveiled in every way that mattered. His guard entirely down for the first time she had witnessed. "I am in danger of wanting you to stay every night," he admitted quietly, not for conversation, not for the excuse of a book, simply because the room is intolerable without you in it, and I have spent 200 years perfecting the art of tolerating empty rooms. "I'm in danger of the same thing," Wren admitted, and something in his shoulders loosened, as though he had braced for a rejection that never came. He did not touch her that night, beyond the brief warmth of his hand closing over hers on the desk between them, but the not touching felt, somehow, like the loudest thing that had ever happened between them, a held breath neither of them was ready to release. Outside, the night garden had reached the particular hour when the moonflowers opened, fully pale and luminous, against the dark hedges, and the scent of jasmine drifted up through the tall windows, on air gone cold enough to fog the glass at its edges. Somewhere below, a fountain that ran only after midnight had begun its low, steady murmur, the one sound in the whole castle that never changed, regardless of what political storm moved through the halls above it. Wren had come to think of that fountain as a kind of metronome for her own courage, a reminder that some things simply kept moving forward, indifferent to fear, and that she might learn to do the same. Della's letters, when they came, had grown warmer and less anxious with each passing week, full of small domestic joys. A courtship with a merchant son, a new dress, their mother's garden finally recovering from the debt collector's visit, and Wren found herself reading each one twice, once for the news and once simply to feel. In her sister's looping handwriting, proof that the sacrifice she'd made had purchased something real. She wrote back with details carefully edited for a sister who did not yet know the full shape of what was happening inside the night court's walls. A kind employer, interesting work, nothing yet of moonlit archives or a king's cold hands learning the shape of her scar in the dark. Some truths, she reasoned, deserved to be delivered in person, not risked to a letter that might be intercepted by a court growing hungrier for gossip by the week. The following days brought the king to her more openly still, not summoned pretexts now, but plain invitations, a walk through the night garden while the moonflowers opened around them, a shared pot of tea in the small hours when neither of them could sleep, an evening spent teaching her the constellations visible only from the castle's northern tower, his cold hand steady at the small of her back as he guided her gaze towards stars he had watched wheel through 200 years of the same lonely sky. "I used to hate this view," he admitted. One such night, the wind pulling at her hair where it had escaped its pins. "I associated it with my queen. We used to stand here together, and after she died, I could not look at these particular stars without feeling as though the whole sky had become a wound." He glanced at her, something soft and unguarded in his expression. "I find I do not mind the view any longer. I think you may have given me back a piece of the sky I thought I'd lost permanently." Wren leaned into his side, careful of the height, careful of her own galloping heart. "I'm glad. Everyone deserves their sky back eventually." Isolde struck 3 days later, and she struck cleverly, in the way of someone who had spent a decade learning exactly where a king's authority ended and a court's gossip began. It happened at the autumn gathering, a formal court event. Wren had been permitted to attend as a servant at the periphery, pouring wine and refilling candles, invisible in the way she had spent a decade perfecting. Isolde found her near the wine table, flanked by 2 of her ladies, her smile sharp as a blade, drawn slow from its sheath. "The veiled kitchen girl," Isolde said, loud enough to draw eyes. "Tell me, does His Majesty know what you were doing in the archive 3 weeks ago? Lone, in the dark, with a servant girl no one thought to vouch for." Her eyes glittered with cruel delight. "Or does he simply not care that you might be exactly what the old prophecies warn against? A witch's agent sent to finish what the curse caster started 2 centuries ago. It would explain a great deal, wouldn't it? A conveniently veiled face, a conveniently sudden intimacy with a king who has resisted every genuine noblewoman in this hall for 200 years. One does wonder what you're truly hiding under that cloth." The accusation landed like a struck bell, rippling outward through the hall in a wave of gasps and whispers. Wren felt the blood drain from her face, felt every eye in the room turn toward her veil with fresh, hungry suspicion, and understood with sick clarity, that Isolde had chosen her weapon with surgical precision, not jealousy dressed as jealousy, which the court would dismiss, but jealousy dressed as a threat to the king's safety, which the court would seize on with righteous fervour. "That is a serious accusation to level without proof," came a voice from across the hall, cold as the archive stone, and the crowd parted as the king crossed toward them, his expression the stillest, most dangerous thing Wren had ever seen on him. "Do you have proof, Isolde, or only the particular jealousy of a woman who has spent 10 years failing to earn what she is now trying to steal by slander?" "I have concern for your Majesty's safety," Isolde said, though her composure had cracked at the edges. "Concern any loyal subject would share, given the circumstances." "The only concerning circumstance in this hall," the king said, "is a courtier attempting to weaponize an unproven rumor against a woman who has done nothing since arriving here but work and endure and be kind to a court that has repaid her with nothing but suspicion." He turned to Wren, and something in his face gentled even as his voice stayed hard for the rest of the room. "You do not need to answer for accusations built on nothing." But the seed was planted, and seeds in a court like this grew fast. Within the hour, whispers had multiplied into a formal demand, voiced by 3 of the older noble families emboldened by Isolde's accusation, that the veiled servant be questioned by the court's own witch hunters, that her face be examined for the curse marks the old prophecies warned of, that the king's growing attachment to a stranger of unknown origin be treated as the security matter it might in fact be. "I cannot simply overrule a formal inquiry from 3 noble houses without appearing to have something to hide myself," the king told her later, in the privacy of his study, his hands raked back through his hair in the first genuinely unguarded gesture of frustration she had seen from him. "If I refuse, I confirm every suspicion," Isolde just planted. "If I allow it, then they see my face regardless of what I want," Wren finished, "under far worse circumstances than I would have chosen." He looked at her, stricken. "I will not allow that. I would rather abdicate this throne than watch you dragged before witch hunters like a criminal for the crime of a scar, and my own poor judgment in caring for you visibly enough that Isolde noticed." "You will do no such thing," Wren said, and found to her own surprise that some old, hard clarity from the day her father's debt collectors arrived had returned to her voice. "I did not survive 10 years of being looked at, like a wound, to now let a jealous woman's slander decide how and when the rest of this court finally sees my face." She stood straighter than she had stood in a decade. "If it must be seen, I will choose the terms myself. Not a witch hunter's inquiry. My own hand, my own timing, my own reasons." That night, unable to sleep, Wren walked the corridor outside her room and found Marta waiting there. An old shawl pulled tight against the cold, her usually brisk composure worn thin with worry. "You should know the whole of it before you decide anything tomorrow," Marta said quietly, drawing her further from any listening door. "Isolde did not invent the witch agent prophecy out of nothing. There is an old text, I've seen it myself, buried in the archive you 2 have taken to haunting, that speaks of a veiled woman who would either break the curse or complete it, depending on whether she came to the king with love or with vengeance in her heart. Isolde knows the text. She has likely known it since the day you arrived, and she has spent every week since trying to convince the court that your motives are the vengeful kind, rather than risk anyone asking her why she cares so much what a serving girl's motives might be. "Then let them ask me plainly what my motives are," Wren said. "I have nothing to hide from that question. Whatever else, I've spent a decade hiding." "That is precisely why she fears you," Marta said, with the ghost of something like pride. "A liar can be caught in a lie. She has no idea what to do with a woman who simply tells the truth and lets the consequences fall where they will. Wren did not sleep well that night, turning over every version of the following evening in her mind, the hostile faces, the witch hunters waiting in the wings should the court session go badly, the particular vulnerability of standing before hundreds of strangers with nothing between her and their judgment but her own resolve. But beneath the fear, something steadier had taken root, the plain, uncomplicated certainty that whatever they saw when she lifted the veil herself, it would at least be seen on her own terms, chosen rather than stolen, and that alone felt like more power than she had held over her own face in a decade. She chose the great hall at the height of the following evening's court session, with every noble house and every whispering courtier present to witness it, because if her face was to become a public matter regardless of her wishes, she intended to be the one who decided what story it told. The hall filled slower than usual that evening, word having spread through every level of the castle that something significant was coming, and Wren stood in the small antechamber behind the throne room doors, listening to the murmur of hundreds of voices swell on the other side. Marta stood beside her, straightening the collar of the plain grey dress Wren had chosen deliberately over anything finer the king's household might have offered, a servant's dress still, because she intended to be seen as exactly who she was, rather than dressed up into someone easier for the court to forgive. "You do not have to do this tonight," Marta said. One last time, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "You could ask for more time. No one would fault you for it." "I have had 10 years of more time," Wren said. It never once made the fear smaller. "I don't think waiting helps. I think doing it helps." She looked toward the doors, gilt and ancient, the same doors she'd first walked through as a frightened debt payment, with no notion of what waited beyond them. Besides, I'd rather they see the truth from me than a lie from her. The doors opened, and she walked through them without waiting to be announced. She stood before the throne, veiled still, the king watching her with an expression of naked fear that had nothing to do with her scar and everything to do with what the court might do once they saw it, once they had proof rather than rumor to work with. "You have accused me," she said, her voice carrying clean across the vast hall, "of hiding a curse mark beneath this veil, of being a witch's agent sent to finish what was started 2 centuries ago. I would like to answer that accusation myself, in my own words, before anyone's hands touch what is mine to reveal." She reached up, and this time it was her own hand, not his, that found the edge of the veil. "What I am hiding," she said, "is not a curse. There, it is a scar earned, pulling my sister from a burning kiln when I was 16 years old, and worn ever since because a village that should have called it courage instead called it something to look away from. I have spent 10 years letting people believe there was something monstrous under this cloth, because it was easier than making them uncomfortable with the ordinary truth, that survival sometimes leaves marks, and marks are not the same thing as monstrosity." She lifted the veil. The gasp that moved through the hall was not the gasp of horror Isolde had clearly hoped to provoke. It was something closer to a held breath finally released. A court confronted with an ordinary human scar where they had been promised a monster, and finding themselves in the anticlimax, ashamed of how eagerly they'd wanted the monster instead. The king rose from his throne and crossed the hall in a way that ignored every formality of court procedure, and stopped before her, close enough that she could see, for the first time in full light, the particular tenderness in his face that she had only ever felt in the dark of the archive. "I have touched this face already," he said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, "in darkness with my own hands, and found in it the first thing in 200 years that made me want to keep living instead of merely enduring. I do not need to see it in torchlight to know its worth. But I am glad now to see what I already knew was there. He turned to the assembled court, his voice going hard and final. Let it be known that any soul in this hall who speaks of witch marks or curse agents regarding Wren Ashcombe will answer to me directly, and I promise you I have had 200 years to grow considerably less patient with cruelty than I once was. Isolde, pale and cornered, made one final desperate grasp. Even if the scar is real, your Majesty risks everything, the curse, the prophecy, his own life, for a serving girl's face. Is that truly the judgment of a king, fit to rule this court? The curse binds me to a heart that cannot love without dying of it, the king said, and something in his voice cracked open entirely, raw and unguarded, before the whole watching hall. I have spent 200 years believing that meant I must never feel anything again. I have learned, these past weeks, that the curse never demanded I stop feeling. It demanded I stop hiding from what I felt. Wren has spent 10 years hiding a scar that was never anything to be ashamed of. I have spent 200 years hiding a heart I was terrified to use again. We have cured each other of the same disease, Isolde, and I find I have absolutely no further use for anyone in this court who cannot recognize love when it is standing in front of them in full torchlight. The breaking of the curse, when it came, was not dramatic. No lightning, no visible magic, unraveling. It was simply this. He took her face in both hands in full light this time, in front of the entire court, and kissed her, and where 200 years of ice-cold skin had always run cold beneath her touch, warmth spread beneath her palms, like a hearth-catching flame after a long winter, and the ancient curse mark burned into the stone beneath the throne, a thing no one but the eldest courtiers had ever noticed, so old it had become simply part of the architecture, cracked once, audibly, and went dark. The aftermath was, in its way, less dramatic than the breaking itself. Isolde was stripped of her title and exiled from court within the week, her slander against Wren the final grievance. In a long list the other noble houses had apparently been quietly compiling for years, Dell arrived a month later for an extended visit, weeping with relief to find her sister not merely safe, but radiant, and stayed long enough to watch the king ask Wren, with the same plain directness that had governed every honest thing between them, whether she would consider making her service to the crown permanent, in a considerably more binding sense. "I did not save your sister, so a king could claim me by contract," Wren told him, teasing, the first time she had felt light enough to tease anyone in a decade. "If you want to claim me, you may ask properly." "Wren Ashcombe," he said, and dropped to one knee in front of the entire kitchen staff, old Tam included, who whooped loud enough to be heard in the West Wing. "Will you stay, not in service, not in debt? Simply because the castle, and I, are considerably less bearable without you, in every room of it." She did not make him wait for an answer. The wedding itself was a smaller affair than 300 years of night court tradition typically demanded. The king's own decree over the vocal objections of the surviving old guard, who felt a coronation-adjacent event ought to involve considerably more ceremony and considerably fewer kitchen staff seated in places of honor near the front. Old Tam wept through the entire vow exchange, and later claimed, loudly and to anyone who would listen, that she had known from the very first week that the veiled girl reorganizing spice jars with unusual precision was destined for considerably more than a servant's contract. Della stood as her sister's witness, radiant in a blue gown that matched nothing in the night court's usual palette of wine and midnight, and cried the particular happy tears of someone watching a decade-long injustice finally fully undone. The curses breaking rippled outward through the court in smaller ways too in the weeks that followed. Courtiers who had spent 2 centuries performing careful blankness around a king who could not be seen to want anything, slowly permitting themselves the same small, unguarded moments they'd once policed out of fear of standing out against his stillness. The night court, Wren began to notice, had been colder than its name required for far longer than the curse alone could explain. Grief, it turned out, was catching, and so, apparently, was its opposite. A year later, the night garden bloomed the same as it always had. Moonflowers, jasmine, pale roses that opened only after dark, but the castle around it had changed in ways the old courtiers still remarked on with a mixture of wonder and relief. The Vampire King laughed now. Sometimes, an event rare enough that servants still occasionally stopped what they were doing to make sure they'd heard it correctly. He ate meals in company rather than alone. He had unlearned, slowly and deliberately, the habit of keeping every door in his life half closed against the possibility of losing something again. Wren no longer wore a veil, though she kept the fine dark gauze folded in a drawer, not out of shame, but out of a strange private fondness for the version of herself who had needed it to survive, long enough to be found by someone who never once needed it removed to see her clearly. Della visited often, married now to a merchant's son and radiantly happy in a life that had never had to be traded for her sister's safety, because in the end, no one had needed to trade anything at all, only to be brave enough to offer what they had. On the anniversary of the night, she'd first crossed the great hall in a black carriage with no windows. Wren stood again in that same hall, this time beside the king rather than before his throne, watching candlelight catch on the old curse-mark scar in the stone, a pale, healed line not unlike the one that still traced her own jaw. Kept, now not as a wound, but as a record of the thing they'd survived together. Any regrets? He asked her, the way he asked most evenings now, half in earnest, and half simply to hear her answer. Only that it took me 26 years to be seen properly, she said, by someone who understood that being seen and being safe were not opposites after all. He kissed the old scar at her throat, the way he had every night since the great hall, gently and without hesitation, and neither of them needed the dark anymore to know exactly what they'd found in each other. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoy these stories and would like to support the channel and get access to exclusive content I share there, you can find me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Let me know what you thought. I always read your comments, and they mean more than you know.